Okay, so it is 6:01 and we are going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us for the Land Stewardship Series. This webinar series will cover a variety of topics, and those topics are related to stewardship and management of natural resources on your land. We typically offer this series as in-person workshops. With webinars, we won't be able to dive as deep as we normally would in those workshops. But the idea is that you'll have the chance to hear from local experts on the basics of each of these topics and then know where to look for more information and find out more on that topic and be able to access some additional resources. So my name is Samantha Tappenbeck. I am the Conservation Programs Manager at the Flathead Conservation District, and I will be facilitating the webinar tonight. I am also joined by Fiona Handler. She is an AmeriCorps member serving a term with us through a program called the Big Sky Watershed Corps. And I am just going to cover a couple of housekeeping items before we get started with the presentation. So by default, your video and audio are turned off. If you have any connectivity issues during the webinar, just exit and then rejoin the meeting. And just be sure to click that same Zoom link that you used to join the first time. So this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and any additional resources that we mentioned tonight will be uploaded and available on our website and YouTube channel within the next week or so. So the presentation today will be about 45 minutes long, and then we're going to have a question and answer session after the presentation, and that'll probably be about 15 minutes. So if you have a question during the presentation, you can go ahead and type it into the Q&A, and you can find that by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the screen. And there's a little icon down there that says Q&A, and it looks like two little chat boxes talking to each other. So you can enter questions as we're going along during the presentation into that Q&A box. During the actual question and answer session following the presentation, you'll also have the opportunity to voice any questions out loud if you'd like to, and you can do that by using the raise hand tool. You can also find that at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little hand raised and it says raise hand underneath it. So please do hold off on those questions you'd like to ask out loud until we are in the question and answer portion of the webinar tonight. So at the end of the webinar, when you leave Zoom, you'll be redirected to a survey. And we really encourage you to fill out that survey. We want to hear from you so that we can improve these kinds of events in the future. And it's also great for us to be able to report and track what participants learned as part of this webinar. So our land stewardship seminar topic this evening is wildlife conflict mitigation. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Kari Eneas. Born and raised on the Flathead Indian Reservation, Kari is a wildlife biologist with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. She completed her master's work with the University of Montana, studying grizzly bear movements in the Mission Valley in relation to habitat selection and small livestock. Continuing to manage carnivore conflicts on the Flathead Indian Reservation, Kari works with local landowners and residents to identify attractants and work proactively towards reducing conflicts with carnivores. So at this time, I will turn it over to Kari, and I will stop my screen share, and Kari, you should be able to take over.
Excellent, thank you, Samantha. I should be able to switch over here. Awesome. All right, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining us here tonight as we talk about carnivores in the Flathead and the Mission Valleys. Really quick, before I get into our talk here tonight, I just wanted to quickly introduce myself and the agency that I do work for. Again, my name is Kari, and last spring I finished my master's thesis in grizzly resource selection out of University of Montana in Missoula. And I'll be speaking a little bit more to that later in our talk here tonight. But first, we're just gonna, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about my general overall experience with wildlife. So since beginning with the wildlife program here on the Flathead Indian Reservation, my colleagues and I have monitored wildlife movements and the use of crossing structures under Highway 93. I have studied barn owl nesting and compared diets to other local raptor and owl species here in the valley as well. We monitor populations of our large ungulates and index water levels for prairie pothole wetlands, kind of down around the Nine Pipes and the Kicking Horse area. And what this does is it helps us to keep track of waterfowl brooding success each year, as well as help us to monitor local waterfowl populations. And each year I contribute to multiple long-term data sets to help with monitoring resident and migrant bird species. Residents being those that are here in Montana year-round, and those migrants being those that typically arrive in the spring and leave in the late summer. We do have a few species that migrate here for the winter because we have less harsh conditions than up in the Arctic tundra. But yep, so we have those resident and migrant species. So we monitor and keep track of those. And I also spend a fair amount of time working with local schools, providing presentations on wildlife and their ecology. I also host a variety of public presentations on bear awareness, as well as carnivore safety here throughout the Flathead Indian Reservation. And so I'm really excited to be here tonight as a guest speaker for this Land Stewardship Series. Most recently, I've been working to reduce grizzly bear conflicts here in the Mission Valley. And this allows me to work directly with landowners and members of the public to provide innovative solutions, keeping people and livestock safe, as well as keeping bears out of trouble. And when I'm not working, I spend even more of my time out playing in the outdoors, hiking and paddleboarding with these two. So as I mentioned, I work for the tribe's wildlife management program, which is just one of the 3 programs in our division of fish, wildlife, and recreation conservation. All of these programs, as well as many others, are nested under the tribe's Natural Resources Department. And this reservation and its boundaries were established in 1855 under the Hellgate Treaty Act. And so in this treaty, there's specific language that was included that preserved the rights of the Salish, the Pend d'Oreille, and the Kootenai people to hunt and fish, as well as collect and gather culturally important plants and foods here on the reservation, but as well as in surrounding areas in Aboriginal territories. CSKT was the first tribal nation to designate a wilderness area within its borders. And so part of that is that our cultural tie to this place and its natural resources is very strong and connected. And so that prompted early leaders of the tribe to preserve these natural spaces that were important to wildlife and plants, crucial to food sovereignty and tribal subsistence living. And so within that wilderness area, we have a seasonal grizzly bear conservation area. And you can see that here in the outlined red area, or red box. So migration of army cutworm moths and ladybug beetles migrate in large numbers to these peaks. That's McDonald Peak there every year. And so what happens is that grizzly bears will gather in high numbers in these on those peaks in order to take advantage of that high calorie food resource. So during July 15th and October 15th of every year, we enact a temporary closure of that area to recreation to prevent conflicts with grizzly bears that are using that during the time, and also, most importantly, to keep people safe from encountering bears in that mountain. The tribes have also designated an elk managed area known as Fair Basin to improve local herds and populations. And early demands and operations of Kerr Dam altered the riparian vegetation and landscapes along the Flathead River corridor, south of Flathead Lake. And so a settlement was reached in order to purchase lands elsewhere on the reservation. And on those lands, we restore and manage habitat for wildlife and human recreation. And so these areas are purchased and rehabilitated in order to replace the habitat that was lost along the river corridor in those early days of the dam's function. So those wildlife mitigation areas are scattered throughout the reservation and designated by these wildlife habitat signs. Recreational use is welcome to everyone in these areas by walk-in access. There is no motorized vehicles permitted in these properties in order to prevent further habitat degradation, but also to promote wildlife health. And so many of these restored and protected drainages are also really important grizzly bear and other carnivore corridors as well. And there are many carnivore species that can be found on the Flathead Indian Reservation, as well as in the greater Flathead Valley area. Each carnivore species has a specific purpose and role in tradition and culture for the Salish, the Kootenai, and the Pend Oreille people. Now you're going to hear me reference the Mission Valley and the reservation down here quite a bit. And so I just wanted to put up a quick reference as to where we are in reference to where you guys are at. And so we're about an hour or so south of Kalispell, and the reservation kind of encompasses that lower portion of Flathead Lake. Now, mountain lions are a common solitary carnivore that can typically be found in forested habitats. And so there are many places here on the reservation that actually got their place name based off of specific Kootenai stories from the mountain lion. Wolves also live in packs and are habitat generalists. And what this means is that they can thrive in a variety of different habitat types. So the wolf was culturally seen as keepers of the health of the land by the tribes here. And the wolf is an important teacher still to this day of family relationships. And though their fur doesn't change color, there are different color morphs of the red fox. The red fox can range, or in these colors, can range from that commonly thought of red color with white tipped tail. They can, but they can also kind of have a really darker color, kind of black, almost silvery look in appearance. And again, they don't change that color throughout the year, but they do have a variety of colors in their pelt. In traditional creation stories, the fox had the power to bring back his mischievous brother, the coyote. Preferring prairies and open landscapes, the coyote was a main figure in traditional creation stories. And there was always a law or a lesson to be learned from his mischievous behaviors. And both black and grizzly bears can be found in the Flathead and Mission Valleys. As omnivores, their diets range from fruits, vegetation, insects, and meat. And locally to the tribes, grizzly bears were considered to be the chief and the strongest of all the animals. They played a spiritual role in many of the tribe's creation stories. And it's told that it was the grizzly who led other animals in creating the world and landscapes that we see for humans and showed people which plants to harvest for food. In today's environment, adapting and learning to live peaceably with wildlife, including the grizzly bear, has become vitally important to maintaining healthy wildlife populations. And understanding the history and ecology of these species can give us insights into how we might better coexist with them. And so let's talk about grizzly bears. When we look at the history of a species like this bear, we can begin to understand the importance of this human and wildlife conflict. Grizzlies crossed over to North America about 60,000 years ago over what's called the Beringia land bridge. And they evolved in the Alaskan tundra, which was a relatively open environment void of trees. And this begins to account for some of those behavioral differences that we see today between grizzly bears and black bears. In the face of danger or when threatened, black bears had the option to retreat and to send their cubs up trees for safety. But because grizzlies evolved without trees, they developed that response of standing their ground and fighting to protect their young. And about 26,000 years ago, grizzlies then expanded down into the Rockies. And being a highly adaptable species, they can survive in habitats like the Gobi deserts of Mongolia. And so in these environments, they're primarily feeding on roots, plants, and small mammals like voles. They can also, though, thrive in areas along the Pacific Rim where their diets consist mainly of salmon and other protein-rich foods. And because of this, they can vary and range in size from about 200 to 300 pounds in the desert and reach up to 2 to 3 times that size and weight in other environments, completely depending on their food. But most importantly, bears can adapt to us. Our actions can influence the behaviors of these bears, like in this picture here. They can become completely habituated to human trash as a food resource. And when encounters between carnivores, garbage, livestock, and humans result in conflict, the safety of both wildlife and humans can be at risk. And while conflict can be broadly defined as a serious disagreement that results in incompatibility, as wildlife researchers and managers, we're usually interested in how conflict pertains to wildlife, more specifically looking at that human and wildlife conflict. But because the threat isn't only towards animals, we can think of this in two different ways. We can focus on either the negative interactions that humans have on wildlife. These could be things like habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, or various forms of human activity. But we can also think of this conflict as the negative interactions that wildlife have on people and our resources. Now, these could be things like crop raiding, human safety, and agricultural depredation. And that leads us to the question, what's the big concern with conflict? A long history of conflict exists between humans and these bears. Following region-wide population declines, the grizzly bear was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. Distribution had been reduced to less than 2% of their historical range here in the lower 48 states. And so this map here shows that historic distribution there in the green, but then that orange is their current range. And these declines were due largely to habitat loss and conflicts between humans and grizzlies. Under the Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan, which was created as part of the Endangered Species Act, recovery areas were established in roadless and undisturbed lands that were predominantly protected. But here we can see those 6 designated recovery zones. And locally, we are located in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem here in the red. Populations here have increased in numbers and range. Early populations estimated about 300 bears in this entire ecosystem at the time that bears were listed in 1975. And recent estimations put the population around 1,000 bears in the NCDE. And so as these populations recover and expand, bears are traveling farther from these protected and public places into private and agricultural lands. And just for a bit of reference, the Mission and Flathead Valleys are part of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And our populations of grizzly bears are really important because of really where we're located. Even though the numbers of bears have increased here in the NCDE and down in the Yellowstone ecosystems, recovery of the grizzly bear as a species depends on connectivity between each of these 6 recovery zones, meaning that bears need to be able to move between them in order to keep strong gene flows going. And so we are positioned right here on those corridors or those pathways between our recovery zone and others like the Selway Bitterroot, the Cabinet Yaak, or the Yellowstone ecosystems. And so grizzly bears are naturally starting to travel between and repopulate new areas between these recovery zones. However, this expansion also increases the contact between humans and bears. And because of this, it's really imperative that our communities here do everything that we can to prevent bears from getting into trouble and developing bad behaviors before they move into areas that haven't had grizzly bears on the landscape in decades. And so here in the Mission Valley, important food resources for bears are plants, insects, and fruit. Most of these foods are found in riparian areas near wetlands. And these habitats also provide hiding cover in an otherwise pretty well open landscape. So bears tend to use these corridors as they move through the valleys. But people also use and build homes in these areas. And so the average distance of a residential home site to the nearest stream, river, or creek is only about 300 meters. And when you factor in that grizzlies are strongly tied to and typically found within only 200 meters of a river or a creek, you can begin to see how the unsecured attractants can increase the potential for conflict. And while grizzlies typically eat plants and fruit, they are omnivorous, and that means that they can incorporate meat into their diets for protein. Animal matter or human food is higher in energy and more digestible to bears than sedges and berries. And so, though not always, they may seek after these resources to increase body mass for winter hibernation. And while bears don't distinguish between wild and domestic animal protein, the resurgence of small farms have created a landscape ripe for conflicts throughout the entire NCDE. Recent changes in funding for pivot irrigation systems has allowed for the farming of crops that weren't traditionally grown in our area. For example, up here in the valley, large acres of land have been transitioned into fields of corn, which unfortunately has attracted bears and become a huge food source. Small livestock are also being raised next to homes and in backyards in both rural and urban environments, both of which have contributed to recent surges of grizzly bear conflict. And conflict can be costly, both to wildlife and to management agencies. Once a bear learns to depredate livestock, management actions may include translocation. A single bear may be relocated more than once because bears often return to the same site or continue to cause trouble where they are released. And this is because once they learn this behavior, it is very difficult for them to unlearn it. It can also take many trapping nights to capture a single conflict bear, which can tie up management agencies. And if bears are repeatedly managed for conflict, management may include lethal actions. Since 2010, here on the reservation, tribal biologists have captured or handled over 30 grizzly bears due to conflict and depredations with small livestock. And of those, 20 have been lethally removed or transported to zoos due to those encounters. And so balancing protection between livestock and grizzly bears has been a challenge. Finding effective methods to reduce the levels of depredation might improve local attitudes toward grizzlies and their conservation. And because of their excellent senses of smell, bears are particularly good at seeking out domestic food sources. Some additional commonly overlooked attractants that we might find around the house and not initially think of as a bear or carnivore attractant could be our garbage or a recently used barbecue grill. And so a lot of times those grills will have grease traps. And if we don't clean those out frequently enough, a lot of times that can, if they're still kind of hot, waft in, coming to check out that smell. Domestic livestock like chickens, goats, pigs and llamas, even sheep. Fruit trees, if we have apples or plums in our yard, in the fall, those ripening fruits, the sugars will attract bears into the yard, as well as grain, calf creep, and other livestock food. This could include chicken feed, Even if we have our chicken coop or our pig pen protected with electric fence, if our food is outside of that and unprotected, that's still a positive food reward that those bears can get into. And so that's something we want to make sure we're keeping secured as well. And then beehives and bird feeders also attract bears into our yards. And again, all of these can attract bears. And once they find an easy meal, they'll tend to return to those same sites again and again, as long as they continue to receive that positive food reward. And because this pattern is hard to break, even with hazing and relocation of animals, habituation or food conditioning to domestic foods often lead to property damage and a carnivore's death. And so the prevention of a bear becoming even used to these foods is the only current solution we have to their survival. And that requires all of our cooperation and diligence. And there are many things that we can do as Flathead and Mission Valley residents that have been proven effective at reducing the amount of conflicts with and preventing this behavior in bears. And so these preventative measures could be things like using bear-resistant trash bins. I know a lot of places that your Republic Service is here, but whoever your waste service is, if you request bear-resistant cans, they can bring those out to you. Using electric fences to protect our small livestock is important, especially if we have them in our backyards next to our homes. We don't want to be drawing bears anywhere that bears or other carnivores anywhere in to our yards that might be close to our children or our pets. If we have large livestock carcasses like horses or cows, make sure to remove those to a distance that's safe from homes or neighbors, or the best thing is to bring them to a composting facility, but really moving those to somewhere where if carnivores are brought in or drawn in, that you're not bringing them closer to the rest of your livestock or to your neighbor's house. Livestock guardian dog use is also something that has been really effective with smaller herds of sheep and goats. And also securing our gardens or our corn with electric fences as well. So as that fruit starts to ripen underground, that can draw bears into our gardens as well. We talked about ripening our fruit or harvesting our fruit as it ripens. And if you do have trees, fruit trees that you want to protect, putting up electric fences around them. They have temporary setups that you can use to help keep bears out of there until your fruit ripens. And one thing too to notice is that if we go back to this page, a lot of these different prevention methods are effective against multiple carnivore species other than just bears as well. So this will, a lot of these things reduce conflicts and issues with mountain lions and wolves. Oops. Even though sometimes when you've taken all of these necessary preventative actions, you're still visited by the occasional bear or wandering mountain lion. And so there are many things that you can do if you're in that situation to deter the animal. If the animal's not necessarily causing harm or threatening anybody's safety, the aim is to make that carnivore's experience on your property as uninviting as possible. And so what tends to happen is that when we have a bear or a mountain lion in the yard, we a lot of times will try to take photos and long videos of that instead of scaring it away initially. And so what signal that's sending to the carnivore is that it's okay to be in an area that close to someone's home or that close to someone's pig pen. So instead of, waiting a long time and being really quiet so we don't scare it off so we can get a good photo or video, making sure we get it out of there as soon as possible so that it learns not to be associated with those areas is really important. And we can do this by using things like loud audio deterrents, things like fog or boat horns are really effective. If you have a shed or a garage that you want to keep kind of carnivores away from, maybe your chicken coop, leaving a radio with a talk show radio station on at night, sometimes just that audio voice throughout the evening is enough to that human voice to keep animals from investigating and staying near these structures where we don't need them. If you have one of the old coffee tins, sometimes dropping firecrackers in those to amplify the sound can spook predators off of your property. And then one thing we use a lot in conflicts are scare devices like this critter getter. And what those are is they're combinations of audio and visual stimulants that are triggered anytime motion is detected in front of that device. And so it's a really effective way to prevent a bear or some other predator from being too close to where we don't want them. And so when we, do though have an issue or a situation where we need to get in contact, or it's important to remember that if bears are causing harm to property or posing a threat to safety, that we call our local authorities right away. And so these numbers up here are local for you guys. If you have a grizzly bear conflict to report up in the Flathead Valley, there's a bear specialist number here at 250-1265. And if you have black bear or mountain lion conflicts, the number to call for them are listed. So that's 250-0062. And so we will have documents at the end, I think, that will be able to be shared that have both of these numbers in them, as well as a lot of the information that I've already given you as far as deterring and preventing bears and carnivores to be in your area. So those should be coming your way. But it's important to note that if wolves or mountain lions are caught in the act of pursuing or directly harassing livestock or pets, or threatening human safety, they may be shot in self-defense. And but it's important that if this happens, that you call the conflict responders immediately to report the incident and that take. So the quicker you call them, the better it is if something like that occurs. But unlike with mountain lions and wolves, there is no legal take or killing of a grizzly bear. So if a grizzly bear is caught in the act of pursuing or harassing livestock or pets, call that conflict call line immediately. A lot of times those are 24-hour services. Call the conflict call line and the bear specialist will be there to respond and to legally remove the animal and to address the attractants too. In the so if you do have a conflict, like you wake up and you find out your chicken coop has been raided by some kind of animal, or you thought you saw a bear out there and it was kind of getting, light out, but you couldn't quite tell. It's really important to call and report those incidents right away. A lot of times what happens is people will wait a few days or wait a week or two before they report that activity. And by the time that that's reported, we can't tell for certain what animal actually caused that conflict. And so we need to be able to correctly ID the offending animal. And so a lot of times if you wait too long, it's really difficult to determine that. So as human populations continue to grow in the NCDE, conflict and livestock depredation by these bears and other carnivores will continue to increase. And so to better understand this issue, it's important to understand how bears use habitat. So as I mentioned earlier, grizzly bears evolved in a treeless environment, meaning that here locally, they were down in the valley bottoms. That distinctive hump that they have between their shoulders is actually a specialized muscle that they use to overturn boulders. And then the 2 to 4 inch claws that they have, they're really impressive, really long. Those are specifically designed for digging ant piles and getting to those root bulbs of different plants down below the ground. A recent study here in the Mission Valley found that grizzlies were strongly tied to streams. When compared to other environmental factors, habitat selection by bears was strongest in these riparian areas. And this is most likely due to the natural food sources found in those corridors. We have fruits like serviceberry and chokecherry. You can find cow parsnips in those riparian areas, as well as various sedges and other vegetation that grow along those streams. And those are the things that bears are keying in and targeting as food. These areas also provide visual and or thermal cover for bears during the hot summer days. You can often identify these corridors by following these large riparian areas across the valley. And so this dense cover allows them to move across the landscape unnoticed by humans and other predators. And so these riparian corridors are really important for connectivity across the Mission Valley. And through habitat modeling, we were able to determine that bears were not searching for livestock or garbage for food here in the Mission Valley, but rather that they were opportunistically coming across them and getting into conflict as they were following those riparian corridors. And so let's just take a closer look here at the Mission Valley. Many Montana residents associate bears with the mountains and don't necessarily think of them down here in the valleys. And as a result, precautions against bear conflict are often not taken because bears aren't really seen in the valley during the day. But when we look at how bears are actually using the valley, we can see that they extensively use these riparian corridors to navigate the landscape. And they go usually completely unnoticed. And so bears are most active during the night. And so they will venture farther from those riparian areas when it's dark out. And so even though we might not see bears down here in the valley, it is important to secure attractants and protect our small livestock to keep these bears from learning these bad behaviors and getting into trouble. Also, we don't want them causing property damage or getting too close to housing structures. And so the population here in Lake County has been increasing about 3 to 5% each year. And so last year, we did have an unprecedented number of new residents that moved into our area. And so this means that, we'll have some more housing developments going in, but we also have new residents here that are potentially unfamiliar living with wildlife species like the grizzly bear or mountain lions. And so this highlights the importance of outreach programs like this to connect residents with resources to living with wildlife. And so to emphasize that importance for each of us to utilize prevention tools on our own properties, this map here just shows the density of residential houses in just a small area of the valley up here, or down here, I guess, in the Mission Valley. So here we've just identified a few sites with livestock. I think there's a couple of chicken coops, some goats, and maybe a pig site there. And then here we see bears using habitat next to these home sites and livestock. And so looking at this photo, it is really easy to see the potential for conflicts. But what's also extremely important to note here is that, because I know it can be really scary when you see that data, none of these bears presented any conflict behaviors or were seen by any humans at any point in time. And so the possibilities of coexisting with these bears are happening right now. And most of the time, they will stay completely out of trouble and are trying to stay as far away from us as possible. But all it takes to turn a bear into a conflict bear is one encounter with an unprotected chicken coop or a garbage can. And so livestock depredation is a behavior that is difficult for them to unlearn. Once a grizzly bear hits a chicken coop, they're going to hit a chicken coop wherever they encounter them. And so it's really important to prevent them from even hitting that first coop. And so now that we know how bears are using riparian corridors and that people and livestock are also found in these areas, let's talk about how effective electric fences are at preventing conflict with livestock. Properly designed electric fences have been used to deter bears from beehives, garbages, and chicken coops. When animals touch an electrified fence, the electrical current passes through the animal into the ground and goes back to the energizer through that grounding rod. That completed circuit, once it gets back into the grounding rod, creates the electric current, and then that's what shocks the animal. A study conducted here in the valley found that small livestock protected by properly functioning electric fences were 100% effective at preventing bears from getting into conflict with small livestock. And so there are a few specifications that are necessary for a fence to deter a grizzly bear. And so be sure to check out the guide that we post for you guys to download in order to have all that information to know what those specifications are, so that if you do create or put up a fence, that it's going to be effective against bears. That same study found that conflict was 50% more likely to occur at sites that did not have electric fence around their livestock. And so you can see in this video that that bear kind of backtracks, and there's a couple of little goat blinking eyes there. So in the next video, she gets back down and just continues to walk by the pen, never approaches it, never touches the fence. But this was a site that the summer before had goat depredations at it. And so by putting that electric fence around, we had multiple instances of different bears walking right on by and not even approaching or investigating the fence. And so that electrical fence barrier is a really, really effective measure to prevent conflict. And these fences also prevent conflict from a variety of other local species like fox, raccoons, coyotes, and skunks. And so after all of that, what does this mean for those living in the Flathead Valley and the greater NCDE? We've learned that grizzlies prefer habitat close to streams. And on average, bears can be found about 170 meters along those riparian areas. And so during the night, remember, they will venture farther from these zones if they smell food close by. We also know that residential homes average a distance of about 300 meters from riparian habitat. That's just over a football field's distance away from where bears are predominantly found near these corridors. And because bears have such an excellent sense of smell, any unsecured attractant near riparian areas have a higher risk of causing conflict or livestock depredation. Small livestock are often raised in coops or pens near homes or in backyards, and they average a distance of about 230 meters from these streams. And when we look at the sites where bears most often got into conflict, with livestock especially, you can see that they are also near this riparian area, almost directly overlapping that area heavily used by grizzly bears. And so this highlights the importance of using preventative tools like electric fencing to protect livestock and garbage and deter bears from getting into conflict in these areas. And when turned on and functioning properly, these fences do offer a non-lethal solution to the protection of garbage and small livestock in these riparian areas. Reducing depredation can help promote coexistence with grizzly bears on the reservation here and in the greater Flathead area, which would allow tribal members and local residents to continue to honor their relationship with the species. And again, this becomes really important when we talk about the movement of these bears between populations and recovery zones. So bears have already been observed and identified in between these recovery areas. And so getting ahead of conflict and depredation in these communities is also going to be important for gaining new and continued support for bear management. Again, we also don't want to be letting our bears learn conflict behavior here and then them moving into areas or naturally migrating down into areas and getting into trouble in these communities that have not dealt with bears either. And so working together and focusing preventative measures along these potential areas of high bear use might help us to reduce conflict. And so our wildlife program, along with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks up your guys' area, work hard to proactively prevent these conflicts. And so there are a few different resource programs that help give people the tools that they need to keep their property and bears safe. When recreating in any wildlife habitat in Western Montana, it is strongly advised to have bear spray and also to know how to use it. Be sure that your bear spray is always within reach and readily available. Backpacking with bear spray in your backpack won't do you any good in a bear encounter. Things happen very incredibly fast. It can sometimes be a matter of seconds that you have in order to get your bear spray ready to deploy. And if it's, tucked in your backpack pocket or, in your back pocket, a lot of times you have to be able to respond quickly. And so carry it on your belt, in your hand, or you can buy little straps, strap your backpack across your waist and attach the bear spray to that strap. Make sure it's somewhere that you've practiced retrieving it from, so that in a high tense situation, it's more like muscle memory and you're not fumbling around trying to remember where you put your bear spray, but that you know where it is and you have that cap off and you're ready to spray it if needed. Kodiak bear-resistant garbage cans also reduce conflicts by preventing bears from identifying that trash as a food source. And so contacting your local service provider and asking them about this option, a lot of times they have these cans available and can switch them out for you. And if you're interested in electric fencing, there are a few local cost sharing programs that will help you protect your livestock, orchards, or your gardens. And so be sure to check out their websites or give me a call. I'll put my phone number up at the end for a consult on the best electric fencing solution for your needs. I can also get you in contact with these folks as well if you're interested in that. And we mentioned that fruit trees can become an attractant to bears. So specific to the Flathead Valley, you can join the Flathead Fruit Gleaning Program if you have apples or plum trees that you would like to have harvested or picked in the fall. And so, but also if you're in search of apples and would like to find somewhere local where you could come and pick some apples and make cider, this is also a really good resource that can get you in touch with local folks that would like to have someone come and pick their apples. So be sure to check this out. It's been pretty successful in reducing apples available on the landscape to bears that would have otherwise attracted them into yards and into home site communities. Be sure to check for backcountry food storage regulations in the wilderness areas as you're out adventuring. Certain areas might have specific regulations and guidelines as far as food storage in campgrounds or hiking in the backcountry. As a general rule, to prevent attracting carnivores into your campsite or into our backyards, if we have a fire pit out back, be sure to keep your fire ring as clean as possible. So burning plates, marshmallows, other garbage and fire rings will actually bring in late night visitors and can actually draw a bear into your campsite or your backyard. And when possible, store all food or cooking equipment in bear-resistant storage containers, or a lot of places, sometimes you'll find bear poles hung up. Use those to store your food. And if none of those are present, store your food inside metal campers or vehicles. So People and Carnivores is a local organization that protects carnivores through helping to find solutions that work for people and wildlife. And so they have installed throughout the mission front and surrounding areas backcountry bear poles at some of the most popular trailheads and campgrounds. And so when you're out hiking about, look for those. And if you need to use them, they're there for your convenience. And so with that, I guess I will pause and hopefully flip over to the Q&A section. Thank you, guys.
All right, Kari, thank you so much for that really informative presentation. So we have not had any questions come through. Oh, what a cute dog. We haven't had any questions come through in the Q&A, so I want to encourage anyone who might have a question or a comment to submit it by typing it into that Q&A chat box. And definitely want to get to those questions, but I do have a few questions of my own, if you'll indulge me. So one thing I've always wondered is if you successfully scare off a bear or other carnivore from your property by, banging pans together, yelling at it to shoo it away, should you still report that interaction?
Typically, we don't see people calling in with those interactions often. I think, the bear specialist, Tim Manley up in your area, I think he does record those as contacts if they do come in. But a lot of times what we see here is that the tolerance kind of with bears is relatively high. And so a lot of times people don't perceive that as a conflict, but that when they actually start property damage or getting into coops, raiding garbages, that kind of stuff is when we start to get those conflict calls. And so that behavior, however, does start, when we see them coming into yards and coming near homes and they aren't scared away right away. And so it is important in those situations to make it very unpleasant for them and let them know that that's not a place that they should be. And that's the first start into preventing those behaviors.
Should you report conflicts that occur with carnivores or other species that aren't bears or mountain lions? Or is anyone interested in tracking that?
Yeah, I'm not sure, like if it's a coyote or a fox. I don't think those are typically reported. I should say, as a wildlife program, we do get calls if there are like fox kits next to, in somebody's culvert next to their home or driveway. People will call and report those for sure. But for the most part, a lot of folks just kind of take care of that and either button it up and put up a fence or something. And yeah.
Right. Okay. So we've had a few questions come in through the Q&A. So last week we talked about composting, and Kristen is wondering how we can make compost piles bear safe.
Yes, I love composting, and I live right next to one of the hottest grizzly bear highways here in Pablo, and so that is always a big concern of mine. The best and easiest solution is electrified fencing. So if you do have like an enclosure or a site where you predominantly have a pile of composting, if you just run an electric fence around that, that smell, especially when it starts to get really fermenty, might bring them in. But as soon as they hit that hot wire, they're not going to stick around. And so if they come and don't receive a positive food reward, they're not going to stay in the area. And a lot of times they'll not come out next time when they smell that. Now you might have a few bears come in a few different nights to test the fence, but once they kind of, all the bears in the area are aware of the fence, then a lot of times that will stop them from checking it out.
Right. So Kari, like you mentioned, there are some programs out there that try to provide some financial and technical assistance to landowners to be able to put up those electric fences. I know in this area, there is funding available and technical support available through Defenders of Wildlife, I believe People and Carnivores, and then for certain areas like the Swan Valley, there's a Swan Valley Bear Resources program that is offered by Swan Valley Connections, and they provide some cost share assistance with those types of methods for securing attractants. So explore those options because they are really helpful. I think, education is always the best method for people to prevent those conflicts, but those incentive programs that are out there certainly help as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Angie Winter asked, well, first she said, thanks for the great information. And she asked, how are you gathering that bear movement data? Are you using collars?
Yeah, so that was actually all part of my thesis study. We started that in 2017, but we had historic data from dating back to 2005. So we had a good chunk in time line of data to use. And yeah, so that all comes from Iridium GPS collars. And so each one of those locations that I would show would just be collar locations that would be sent via satellite to our computers. And so for that specific study, we had 8 females collared here in the valley, and I'm trying to think there wasn't a male in there, so they're all females. And we tried to keep, so part of the larger Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, we have population trend monitoring. And so we always try to keep at least one bear collared to contribute data to that larger research program that's continually going on for bear monitoring.
So Terry asks, what can we do about barbecue grills if those are attractive to bears?
Yeah, so what I do and what I really stress is that just like after you've cooked and after it's cooled down, a lot of times, just that cleaning the grill with the brushes after you've cooked instead of before you go out to cook the next time is what a lot of folks do. Just making sure it's cleaned up after it's cooled down, and then if you do have one of those grease traps, to just empty it periodically so that it's not continually like collecting new grease and new fats. And then yeah, that's the best way for sure.
So this is a good question, one that I'm interested in the answer to. We have 5 dogs that range around the homestead during the day, but are in a small area during the evening. Will that deter a bear?
So, I would say it would be dependent on the type of dog, because there are, so with livestock guardian dogs, or there are Karelian bear dogs, there are specific breeds that are aggressive, and like it's their job to keep bears and other predators away. But a lot of times what I've noticed with, most dogs is that if a bear's in the area, they are going to tend to be more quiet and not alarm every time that there is potentially a carnivore close. And so that might not be enough. And especially if they're kind of enclosed and like into a smaller enclosure at night, they're not walking the perimeter. A big thing with livestock dogs is that they're kind of living with the flock, and so they're moving with the flock. And so if you have your dogs penned in at night, they're not walking the perimeter of your yard or your flock, and they're not able to provide adequate protection.
Do you see many folks with bear dogs down in the Mission Valley or even in this area?
There are, not in the Mission Valley, but the Jocko Valley, the Arley area, there's a guy who trains dogs there, and he uses them to haze bears out of like cornfields, that sort of stuff. I know in the Missoula area, there are people that use them quite a bit, and I think I'll have to chat because I know people in Carnivores will help with the cost of obtaining a livestock guardian dog as well, because there's a lot of costs that are involved in the training and that sort of stuff, because they do need to be trained for specific livestock purposes or guarding purposes. And so there are programs that can help with them. And so I think they have placed a few guardian dogs in the valley, but it's becoming more known, but it's not heavily used at the moment.
All right, I have a follow-up dog-related question. I know you're not supposed to leave dog food out. If it's not actively being eaten, you bring it inside. However, I've always wondered, are bears or other carnivores attracted to dog waste?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't believe so. Yeah, because I've seen videos where dogs will have used an area like at a not a composting, but a dead pit. Some ranchers will put, if they have a dead pit, a camera on it and kind of help us monitor bears that way. And a lot of times, a lot of dogs will come in and bears will come in, and they usually don't overlap in like where the areas that they use. So I wouldn't think that they would attract, or that dog scat would attract a bear. But so thanks for bringing dog food on the porch up, because it is important that if we do feed our dogs on the porch and even bring the food in the evenings, that our dogs aren't dropping those kibbles underneath of the porch, because we have had instances where food isn't left on the porch but gets underneath, and then bears will come and rip up the porch to get at those few kibbles on the ground. So it doesn't happen often, but it has been a thing that has occurred. So
All right, so we have a question from Amy Johnson. So is free ranging chickens on my property completely off the table, given that neighbors on both sides have had their coops ravaged that are not protected by electric fence? Sounds like bears return to the same scene again and again, so season after season.
Yeah, and again, it's because they've received that positive food reward. So they will come back and they have incredibly good memories. So they will come back to an area if they've found food before and they continue to find that positive food reward. So free ranging is definitely not out of the question. What a lot of folks do is they'll let their chickens range during the day, again, because mostly bears aren't out walking through these areas during the day, but that's mostly at night. And so if we can bring in our chickens into an enclosure or a coop in the evening, something that we can electrify, run a fence around, or at least get the main entrances kind of electrified so that if a bear tries to get into the coop, they'll get that shock. They won't have that positive food reward, and they won't get into the coop or the structure. Now, if you do have neighbors that also have unprotected coops that are kind of continually being depredated, bears will probably still come into the area to check out those coops. But if they do encounter yours and yours is secured and all of your chickens are in your coop at night, that will prevent your coop from being raided. But also one thing too that's really important to note is that we as neighbors and community members have a huge influence on our neighbors as well. And so if we can, a lot of times some neighbors will start to use electric fences or use bear resistant garbages if we start to see that our neighbors are. And because we don't want to be the one, the only one on the block who's not utilizing those sources or who's kind of bringing all the bears into the area. So a lot of times just having those conversations with your neighbors where if you have electric fences and it starts to really work, just sharing those experiences, and then, maybe you can kind of grow that theme throughout your neighborhood, and then eventually, stop. Once the bears realize that there isn't a food reward at those coops anymore, they'll, kind of not come in as frequently.
Right. All right, so Tim Mack asks, if you do encounter a bear on a trail, what is the best way to avoid a confrontation?
Yes, so definitely make yourself known, just talk in a very calm manner. So if you're coming up and let's say a bear walks across the path, immediately grab your spray and just make sure it's ready to be used and kind of back away slowly. And especially if the bear has noticed you, just say like, "Whoa, bear," in a very calm, kind of even tone voice, not making any threatening movements or, and it's different with the different carnivores because you want to be non-threatening, you want to be very calm and kind of back away slowly if it's a bear encounter. Now, if it were a mountain lion encounter, a lot of times they are, and black bears as well, they're more curious, but you still want to handle that kind of situation the same. Whereas a mountain lion, you're going to want to be kind of more bigger and threatening and, waving your hands a little bit so that they aren't inclined to come and check you out. And so, the way that you react to those different predators are a little different, but definitely with bears, you definitely want to be calm and unthreatening.
On a related note, does bear spray work on mountain lions?
Yes, it does. It is. I would use it. I carry it when I run. Usually I'm more, nervous of encountering a mountain lion on a trail run than a bear usually. And so, I am, yep, I've definitely asked a lot of folks that question and I've heard that it definitely would be effective. Just the way though that a mountain lion would approach versus a bear. So a grizzly bear especially is going to come in really fast and really hot. And a lot of times it's just going to be a bluff charge. But you want to, because of the distance that they're covering in a short amount of time, you want to spray in like a zigzag pattern, not at the ground or not at the bear's head. Because if you spray straight out at its head, it's going to miss. You want to spray it at the ground and cover as much ground as possible so that it starts to rise as the bear gets closer. And so with the mountain lion, it's going to be similar, but they're not going to be coming in as fast. So you won't want to deploy your bear spray as early as you would if it were a bear attack. So just kind of be mindful of that.
So we have a question from Elysian. She says, I know that wolves usually run in packs, and I haven't heard of very many problems. Do you have any data on that? I am much more worried about a pack of wolves than a single bear encounter regarding livestock.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't have too much experience with wolves. I know that we do have a few packs here on the reservation as well, and there have been a few depredations, but a lot of times, there are certain things that you can take, or certain preventative measures that can be aimed specifically at wolves. And so in one of the, in the carnivore handbook that you'll be able to download once this webinar is posted, the recording of it is, that will have specific like flaggery and other different preventative measures you can use against wolves. As far as the fact that they're in a pack making them more dangerous, I don't think that necessarily has too big of an impact, because especially with grizzly bears, I know, especially, I don't know so much black bears, but they do go into, like if they get into a chicken coop or into a pen with goats, kind of evolutionarily, they're trying to down as many animals as possible so that they have food. And a lot of times mountain lions as well, they will attack and then they'll bury their food and they'll come back and protect that specific area. And so a lot of times you'll have, 15 to 20 chickens depredated in a night. And that's because like a bear is intending to come back every night and to continue to eat that food source. And so, I think depredation wise, they can probably have this like similar impacts, but yeah, that handbook will be really cool and goes a lot more kind of in depth on some of those preventative measures for the different carnivore species.
Great. This is an interesting question from Brenda. Are there any studies about at what point the density of houses and/or people will discourage bear and wildlife encounters?
So there have been studies like on densities of like electric fence effectiveness. Like Durango, Colorado has done a few studies looking at bear-resistant trash cans in reducing conflicts. And they, took a few different communities or sections of the community and had like 100% of all the cans Kodiak, and then they had another where they weren't all, bear resistant, but there were some unresistant trash cans, and then they compared conflicts in those areas, and they did find that there is a threshold to how many sites in the neighborhood have to be protected or have to eliminate that food source before you kind of protect the whole area. So there are research into those types of things, but as far as home sites, there are I guess when you look at some research like up in Canada, there are there are certain like road densities and different things like that will start to prevent bears from using an area. But what was unique about the Mission Valley here is that our results actually showed that there, it might just be because we were studying down in a valley where there are residential sites as opposed to up in the missions or up in kind of remote areas, but that bears aren't avoiding roads or houses, but that some bears actually are found more often in areas with higher densities of homes and roads. And whether that's just because we have more home sites in those or road densities in those riparian areas, or whether because bears are actually finding security and food in those, smaller communities, we can't tease that apart without further investigation. But that, Ideally, the more roads and homes you have, the less you would have bears, but that's definitely not kind of what we see here in our area.
Yeah, I would assume it is a balance between density and habitat connectivity, and at some point there's not enough habitat or ability to use that area for bears to be present. But then, of course, that's a trade-off.
Mhm.
Kind of a related question I have is, I think a lot of people might hear that, bears and wildlife use riparian areas as corridors. And if they live in that corridor, they might think, well, should I just clear all of the vegetation around my riparian area? And then, that won't be usable habitat, so we won't have conflicts. And I would be interested to hear your response to that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, especially because we do have such a large kind of percentage of home sites in that area. And I think, that would be interesting, to look at to see whether or not that serves to fragment the habitat and kind of cut off corridors for wildlife use. I don't necessarily think it would, just because they are so strongly tied to that riparian or to that essentially stream and that water source. They're going to be following that down, the streamline, and so they will still move through those areas. Now, if you, do it in a way where there's still like ground cover, thermal cover, but if you remove like the berry bushes, they probably wouldn't be hanging in that area for that food source. But again, they're going to still be able to find it before, like upstream and downstream of where you're at there. And again, so riparian areas are also incredibly important habitats for birds, especially our spring and summer residents. And so, when we talk about removing riparian habitats, we have to also look at and think about the effects that would have on other species and the larger connectivity of wildlife as a whole. Yeah, and I think if you are a landowner that has riparian habitat in their home, similarly here where I'm at, I have a canal that runs through and a huge swamp, on part of my property. And so there are, just coexisting with bears using the habitat around your house as possible. There are just some things that we can do to prevent them from, coming out of the riparian and investigating our houses, or, just also being really wary of, well, if we know there are, hawthorn or chokecherry trees at the end of our property, just at certain times of the year when the berries are ripe, we might not want to be in that, heavily thicked area, heavily dense vegetation, during certain times of year, and then to always kind of have bear spray on hand if we're out working, collecting apples, that kind of stuff, because definitely like they're going to try and stay away from us and out of trouble as much as possible. So the less we can kind of surprise them in that thick vegetation, the better off they'll be.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question. This question is from Gordon. How do bears travel, for example, between the Yellowstone area and the Flathead area?
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm savvy enough to quickly share a screen again, but I'm going to try and find that map and put it back up. And then if I can share a screen. Hold on a second.
Okay. Someone had also asked for your contact information again, and I gave your email, but I didn't know if you wanted to share your phone number.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. So to get a hold of me, the best way would be to, oops, I shared the wrong one. Contact me at 675-2700, and my extension is 7217. Okay, that's the right screen. So in between the NCDE and the other, or the Greater Yellowstone down there, so you can see that kind of long area with the bottom. There has been a study conducted that have identified particularly, there's a study that predicted pathways that are most likely to be used by grizzly bears. And so they incorporated data from some of the observations that they've had of bears kind of periodically kind of dispersed throughout there, but kind of similarly to how they use habitat in the NCDE and the GYE. So they're predominantly following those riparian corridors. And so they're looking for those larger kind of areas of intact vegetation as they're moving through, so they those new areas. And so one thing when we talk about trying to get ahead of conflict in these communities is being able to work with, you know, people that do live in that riparian area, or in those communities that are right along those high predicted pathways, and really working with them on bear awareness and trying to, you know, incorporate as much of these preventative measures and deterrence measures as possible, you know, kind of before bears really get a foothold and start to find those resources as food, before they start to develop them as food resources.
Okay. Kari, thank you again so much for spending your time with us tonight and presenting all that great information. Again, this webinar has been recorded, and we are going to post the recording with some of the really excellent resources that Kari provided to us on our website. You can also watch the recording on our YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that, and we should have that up like within the next week or so at the longest. So stay tuned, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Again, once you leave the webinar, you will be redirected to a survey, and we would really appreciate any feedback you have to offer. Please do stay tuned for the next installment of the Land Stewardship Series next week. We are going to be talking about pasture management, and it should be a really interesting topic, and we hope to see you there. Thanks everyone for joining in. Have a great night.
Good night.